Now that we have a good understanding about the directionals around and within the body, now we can move to the specific components of the skull and the bones of the skull, as well as some of the prominent landmarks and features like suture lines. So in this segment, the second part, we're going to learn about the bones of the skull, the most prominent ones that we won't necessarily emphasize, and then some specific features that will also come into play in the next part of the course when we start sexing the skeleton, using it for the biological profile, that is, figuring out whether the components of a skull or bones from it are either male or female during life. Herein lies some of the major components of the skull. If you have the skull, oftentimes you are specifically referring to, technically, when we look at anatomy and osteological terms, that if you use the term skull, you're talking about the cranium plus the mandible. If you use the term cranium, you're talking about every bone in this picture except the mandible. And then the cranial vault is the component that typically only includes the brain case or those bones that articulate or directly connect or touch the brain. There are a total of 28 bones of the skull. You may have taken an anatomy and physiology class. You may search online, the number of bones of the skull. You might get to a page that says there are 22. Well, that's incorrect. There are a total of 28 because what they're missing are the 3 bones of your inner ear. And since these are paired and they fall along the sagittal plane, remember that's the part dimension, plane of your body that is symmetric. And so 22 plus 3, bones of the ear on each side equals 28. So there's a total of 28 bones of the skull. That would mean that there's 27 if you're only talking about the cranium, because the skull includes the mandible where the cranium technically does not. We have some bones that are singular, some that are paired. You can see that if they're paired, they probably fall along the sagittal plane, which, again, remember, cuts your body in half side to side in the midline, and then everything that moves away would be lateral. See, now we can use some of this terminology to orient ourselves when we start talking about bones of the human skeleton. You can see that I have some of these words in bold. These are the bones that we're going to focus on in this class. There are ones that I think it's a purple hue or puce, right? You don't really need to know them for this class. They aren't quite emphasized. They're typically smaller bones. They're not quite significant. Yes, you should be able to identify them if you're a forensic anthropologist. However, they're not going to really tell us much in terms of the biological profile, which is the second part of the class, determining whether remains are male or female. So we'll go over the frontal, the occipital, the sphenoid, and the mandible, as well as the parietal, temporal, maxilla, and nasal bones, as well as the zygomatic. Those ones are paired. The first bone I'd like to discuss is the frontal bone. The frontal bone is the part of the cranium that includes the areas of the frontal lobe. They make up the superior part of your eye orbits, and they extend all the way to the top of your forehead, as well as you can see a suture line, which is a suture line is just a area or a line that shows an articulation area between two bones that makes up kind of the top of your head. And I want to draw your attention to what's known as the supraorbital region. Right now that you know directionals within and around the body, we can use these terms. Supra, or superior, meaning above. the orbit. So it's the top part of your eye orbit. So supraorbital region or ridge. It's also termed a brow ridge. This is an important feature because typically we see males with larger, more robust, and more pronounced and prominent brow ridges. It's one way to indicate whether an individual's skeletal material is either a male or female. So be aware that's a very important landmark as we move along in the course. The parietal bones make up the largest lateral portions of the cranial vault, or the cranium for that matter. You can see they're typed in green. They're paired bones, and they form a number of different suture lines articulated with themselves, as well as other bones like the frontal. You can see that on the lateral portion of the parietal, there are very long grooves, very prominent to see. On the infracranial surface, on the inside, the endocranial surface, you can actually see some of the meningeal grooves that have made marks on the inside of the parietal, showing you the extent of the veins and blood vessels, capillaries that encapsulate the brain. So the parietal is a difficult bone to identify if you don't have some of these landmarks. It won't be completely emphasized in this class, but it's very important to know. The occipital bone is a very important bone because it forms the most posterior as well as inferior portion of your cranium. It also houses the occipital lobes. And there are a few features, right? It's a single bone, it's not paired. There are a few important features like the nuchal region or nuchal crest. In some academic circles, osteological schools of thought, it's also known as the external occipital protuberance. Protuberance being some type of extension. You can see that the nuchal region is an area where there are muscles attached. And this is important because males typically have larger musculature. And oftentimes, males will exhibit a much more prominent nuchal region because males typically have more musculature than females. It's something that we've inherited from our primate ancestors. Once you turn the cranium upside down and look at the inferior view, you can see what's known as the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is a very important feature. And if we break it down, a foramen is just a hole in bone. And that hole can be made for blood vessels, capillaries, nerves, veins, and even nerves. And magnum means big. So a foramen magnum is a very big hole in your skeleton. As a matter of fact, it is the largest foramen in all of your skeleton. And it's important because the foramen magnum houses your brainstem and your spinal cord and gives us that orientation. Your foramen magnum is tucked, completely directly underneath you or inferior. That's because you walk on two legs. Now that we've covered these major bones of the cranial vault around the brain case, we can talk about some of the suture lines. And some of these words should sound familiar, like coronal plane and sagittal plane. Well, they follow along, for the most part, those planes of the body. The coronal plane, is something that kind of cuts you in half front to back. Not symmetrical. And so the coronal suture is named for that plane that's parallel with it. The sagittal plane is the midline that cuts you in half side to side. It's symmetric. And there's no greater name for this suture line that runs down and articulates with both left lateral and right lateral parietal bones. The lambdoidal suture is the suture that articulates the occipital with the parietal bones. So these are three important sutures that you should know. One, because it shows you where the articulation centers are for major bones of the cranium and the cranial base or the cranial vault. And it's important when you think about ontogeny or development. If you look in the lower right corner, that's the skull of a baby or a child. And you've heard the expression that babies have soft spots. Well, they do around those areas, the suture lines, because most of our adult brain has to grow outside of our mother's wombs because our brain is so big. Our brain is so big in comparison to our body size that we only share this encephalized or very large brain with dolphins, orcas, and whales. That means that other organisms like a chimpanzee, which is very closely related to humans, that their adult brain is ready to go, more ready to go than human. You can see human babies are effectively helpless. We can't even cling to our mothers. And it's because we have less of our adult brain ready to go outside of the mother's womb. I think a chimpanzee has about 50% of its adult brain already grown. Humans are about half that. The temporal bone is a very important bone because it has a lot of anatomical features that are associated with it. It's a paired bone, meaning it has a left and a right lateral portion. It includes parts of the external ear and middle and internal ear. It articulates with a number of bones on the cranium, and it articulates with the mandible. You can also see that it creates a bridge with another bone here in orange known as the zygomatic. And so that's something you can feel on the side of your face very easily. If you take the top of the cranium off and you look inside in the middle picture here, you can see an area of the middle and inner ear exposed once this part of the cranium is removed. You can also see on the photo on the far right that it has this long protrusion, and just anterior there's a fossa or a cup where your mandibular condyles fit. So if you were ever asked, what bone articulates with the temporal bone, the answer is the mandible. Now let's go over a number of different features that are on the temporal bone that are essential when we look at how it articulates with other bones of the skull, as well as some features that are important to know anatomically, as well as ones that are sexually dimorphic. This is what I mean when we can try to figure out the differences between males and females with skeletal material. Sexual, binary, male or female, dimorphism, di meaning two, morph meaning shape or size, something that's different, that's measurable. You can see that the area that articulates with the mandible is known as the temporomandibular joint. There's also the external ear hole, which is the opening to other components of the ear. And this is known as the technically external auditory meatus, just a very fancy term for the ear hole. And inside the middle and inner ear, remember, if we can remove the top of the cranium, we can actually see that area. It's known as the petrous portion or the pars petrosa. It is one of the most dense bones we have in our body besides maybe your femur. It's usually very well preserved. We can actually extract DNA from this bone because there's a high concentration of bone, and it makes it easiest for us to do this both in a forensic context, also archaeologically. The mastoid process is the last feature, and it's probably the most important out of all of these because it's the most sexually dimorphic. Males typically have a much larger, longer, and broader mastoid process, whereas females have one that's descended, small, and sometimes barely visible. The mastoid process, as well as the medial part of your clavicle or your collarbone, contains a muscle known as the sternocleidomastoid. And what this does is, and you can see this muscle, it's the one that makes like a nice V shape if you're looking at somebody's neck anteriorly. And you can feel them on the sides of your neck, very prominent muscle, and you can feel where it articulates and connects with the mastoid process. If you contract, as muscles only do, contract and are relaxed. If you contract the right lateral sternocleidomastoid, you will turn your head to the left. If you contract the left lateral one, you turn your head to the right. If you contract both of them at the same time, you hopefully are nodding yes like I am right now. So males, again, just like the nuchal crest or the nuchal region on the occipital, have more musculature. And that's why the mastoid process is usually larger in males than females. The sphenoid is an important bone. It's not entirely emphasized in this class. It's a difficult bone to see, and typically you can only see it from the lateral, left and right lateral wings of the sphenoid, as well as the inferior aspect of the sphenoid when you look at the cranium. If you look at the inside, the infracranial or the endocranial area inside, once you move the cap of the brain case or cranial vault, you can see the sphenoid inside here in the middle picture, and you can see a number of different prominent features that are part of the eye orbits, areas that are opening for the optic nerve. There's right in the middle, there's like a little fossa or cup. That's known as the sella turcica. And that is where your pituitary gland is, and this regulates growth hormones. The sphenoid, because it's hard to see, one of the reasons is because it articulates with just about every other bone in the cranium. That's why it's known as the key to the skull. The next bone I want to talk about is the maxilla. The maxilla is a paired bone, and it has two halves, left and right lateral. It has a nice midline, that articulation center in which you're looking at inferior view. It also makes up half of your nasal aperture, or the opening for your nasal cavity. The maxilla also holds your upper or maxillary dentition, right, your teeth. You can see that parts of what we think is your cheekbone are actually your maxilla, and there's a very large foramen or hole that holds lots of nerves, cranial nerves, that are connected to your teeth. When a doctor or dentist takes a needle, local anesthetic or Novocaine, they're trying to find the area of that nerve around the area of the nasal sinus to numb your teeth. So the maxilla is paired. It has the maxillary teeth, and there are a few other features we can look at on the next slide. If we turn the cranium upside down and look at the inferior view, you have the maxilla. You can see the nice midline that separates the two halves of your maxilla. Remember, it's a paired bone, and it falls right along the sagittal plane, being symmetric. You also have palatine bones. This is typically known as your kind of like your soft palate, right? Your hard palate would include parts of the maxilla, and then you have these very small palatine bones. Oftentimes, the palatine or palatine bones, they will actually fuse to the maxilla, and when you're holding the bone of a maxilla, you will also be holding the palatine bones. Sometimes people don't notice, but a very keen osteologist will recognize these features and other bones. The zygomatic is a paired bone. It articulates with the maxilla to make parts of your inferior eye orbits as well as your lateral eye orbits, and it will form this arch, which is known as the temporal zygomatic arch, that, as you may have guessed, articulates with the temporal bone. This is oftentimes known as your cheekbone, but it's probably smaller in proportion to what you would think as your cheek, because your cheek actually includes both your zygomatic as well as your maxilla, as we stated before. Zygomatic can be sexually dimorphic. Sometimes males will have larger zygomatics, and this might have to do with musculature and the muscles of chewing or mastication. The nasal bones, they won't be quite emphasized in this class. They aren't necessarily sexually dimorphic. It's important to remember that there's two of them. They're paired. There's a nice little midline along the sagittal plane separating the two bones. This is the bony part of your nose, because most of the other aspects of your nose that we look at and think of are cartilaginous. And when you break your nose, right, you could injure it like the area of the septum, which separates the two halves of your nostril. And, that's mostly cartilaginous, very hard cartilage. But you can also break your nose in the area of the nasal bones. And of course, if you think about what we're going to see skeletally, it's the nasal bones that will be healed if there was a break there. So it's not necessarily a very prominent bone. It's not one that we can really tell the difference between males and females, but just that bone or those bones or left and right portions. But it's important to know that it can be a site for injury and areas for healing that can be also used for identification of human skeletal remains. The mandible is the last bone that we're going to discuss in this lecture. You remove the mandible from the cranium, you don't have a skull anymore. You remove the mandible from the cranium, now you've got 27 bones, including the ear bones as part of the cranium. You put them together, now you got a total of 28 in the skull. The mandible has a number of different prominent features that we'll talk about in the next slide. And for the most part, the obvious component is that it holds your mandibular or your lower dentition or teeth. So the mandible is actually a paired bone when you're a child. And early on, it will fuse together and become one. And that line of fusion will be gone, that suture line be completely obliterated. And this is the area of the mandibular symphysis, right along the midline or sagittal plane. And so we'll call this the mandibular symphysis, or you may hear it also called the mental eminence. The mandible is sexually dimorphic. And so areas of the mandibular corpus, which is kind of the body, that's what corpus means body, the main body lateral portion of the mandible, as well as the mandibular ramus, which is the area that ascends to the mandibular condyles, which form the temporal mandibular joint, articulating with the temporal bone. The mandibular symphysis or mental eminence is sexually dimorphic in a way that males typically have square chins, and you'll have more bony protrusion, much more robust in that center anterior portion of the chin. The mandibular ramus and the most lateral edge is known as the gonial angle. And at this point, you'll typically see a much more lateral extension of the mandibular ramus in the inferior aspect. This is where you'll see males with a bit of a flare, that the mandibular ramus, unless you're some European models actually have this feature, women. And then the mandibular condyle is the area where you have the joint articulation at the temporal mandibular joint, right? That is articulating with the temporal.